This is part two of the Jewish perspective on abortion. In part one, our focus was on biblical texts and the commentaries thereon and translations of the biblical text. We did a little bit with Midrash, but our focus for today is going to be on the huge volume of Jewish texts that are associated with the rabbis. And by the rabbis here, I refer to the rabbis of the Talmudic era. So dating back probably about, say, 1,800 years ago to the present. Those are the sources that we're going to be looking at today. We did a bit of a transition in section one. In part one of this two-part series, we did a bit of a transition to the rabbinic period by looking at the Mishnah. This was a work that was codified around 200 of the Common Era. And we also looked at the Tosefta, which was additional teachings that came from the era of the Mishnaic period, about 200 before the Common Era to about 200 of the Common Era. But we're going to segue now to the Talmud itself. And we'll do a little bit more in the midrashic vein, the additional materials written during the rabbinic period. And then we'll also be looking at codes of Jewish law. We'll be looking at responsa texts. These are all sources that extend to the present day. Responsa are continuing to be written. These are questions that are posed to a rabbinic authority, and then some kind of a response is generated, usually touching back on all the previous texts, and then expanding to answer questions that may not have been posed in the past. Now, with abortion, of course, we have a topic that was a topic that had relevance even long ago, but medical advances have changed the situation, and additional understanding of fetal development has changed the situation. So responsa continued to be written on this topic, and Judaism is an evolving tradition. We look to the past for guidance, and we continue to generate new texts as new circumstances develop. So our first text comes from the Talmud. This is from a tractate known as Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, the rabbinical court in the Temple era. And this passage in Sanhedrin, this happens to be tractate Sanhedrin, page 91b. The Talmud has standardized pagination, and each folio, as it's called, has an A side and a B side. So this is page 91, on the back side, the B side. And here we have a discussion that takes place between the Roman emperor, who's named Antoninus here in the Talmud, and also Rebbe, who is the Rabbi Judah Hanasi, the editor of the Mishnah. So this is a conversation that takes place between the two of them. And the question is posed, and Antoninus also asked Rebbe, from when does the evil inclination have influence over a person? Is it from the moment of the embryo's formation or from the moment of birth? So you can see that that the rabbis have probably created a narrative here. I can't say that this conversation actually took place, but the rabbis have created a narrative where Antoninus, the emperor, Caesar Antony probably, is speaking with the leading Jewish authority and is asking about evil inclination. But there's another text that's more germane. It's in the same spirit, and it says, when is the soul placed into man? So here the question is posed to Rebbe, when is ensoulment? When does the soul come into a person? And the question goes on, is it from the moment of attention? So this is when well, at least according to some authorities, that that there's some attention being paid to this conceived this fertilized egg. Is that the moment that the soul is placed into a being, or is it from the moment of the embryo's formation? And Rebbe says to the Antoninus, it is from the moment of the embryo's formation that it receives a soul. So that sounds quite definitive about when the soul comes into existence, but it's actually far more complicated than that. And let me turn now to a midrashic work. This is Bereshit Rabbah. So this is a midrashic work on the book of Genesis, but it goes into many other texts in the process. And here we actually have a parallel version of the same discussion, because the rabbis recorded this in multiple places. It's recorded in the Talmud. It's also recorded in the Midrash. And sometimes there are subtle differences between the different versions, and sometimes they're quite similar. Here it says, and Antoninus asked our master, that's Rebbe, a question. He said to him, "From when is the soul placed within a man? From when he emerges from his mother's innards," meaning birth, "or from well before he emerges from his mother's innards?" And Rebbe's response to Antoninus is, "From when he emerges from his mother's innards." Now, I have seen places where that is how the text is cited, and it's used as validation of the idea that ensoulment takes place at the moment of birth. And people have quoted that text from Bereshit Rabbah as support for the contention that that is when ensoulment happens. What's interesting to me, though, is that that's a bit of a cheat, because the text goes on, that this conversation continues, and Antoninus is actually disputing what Rebbe says. Antoninus says to Rebbe, "It is not so." He disagrees. And he makes an analogy. He says, if you leave meat for 3 days without salt, it immediately becomes putrid. And the idea is that the soul is in some sense the salt. And if you don't have the soul, then the physical matter, the fertilized egg, becomes putrid. And now the Bereshit Rabbah text goes on to say, and Rebbe conceded to Antoninus that he aligned his view with the view of the verse, and then it gives a biblical verse from the book of Job. So he says, "From when did you place the soul within me? From when you attended to me," meaning much earlier than birth. What's interesting to me about this is that you have to be very careful when citing texts. That's the reason why it's important to see the context. And in this case, it's to see that the conversation continues, and Rebbe actually appears to change his mind. So you could kind of support arguments on either side, and that's a bit problematic if you're trying to get a definitive answer. But of course, in Judaism, it's very hard to get clear-cut black and white answers, and maybe that's one of the messages of this whole discussion about the topic of Jewish approach to abortion, is that there is no black and white. Judaism does not generally take an extreme position one way or the other, and it's because in the end, if you have some firm belief in a soul, which I would say is already maybe problematic because we don't have a way to prove that the soul exists, but if you accept the idea of a soul, then we certainly don't know with any confidence when does the soul actually become part with the body. So this is actually the reason for fuzzy answers to some of these important questions. I'm going to share with you another text, which is germane to our topic. This is another Talmudic text. And in this text, we're going to find out something about the difference between Jews and non-Jews as far as abortion goes. So this comes from from Tractate Sanhedrin, but a different place in Tractate Sanhedrin. This is page 57, side B. And it says, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, they said, a Noahite. So this is somebody who's not Jewish, but is bound by the so-called 7 Noahite commandments. A Noahite is liable even for killing fetuses. So that's an interesting statement. And obviously in contemporary society, it's not like we're having civil laws that draw distinctions between Jews and non-Jews, but we do appreciate that in the rabbinic literature, they felt that certain laws were incumbent on non-Jews. And those laws might differ substantially from laws incumbent on Jews. I'm going to go on now to share with you a different Talmudic text. And this is, to me, quite interesting that the Mishnah is a fairly accepted body that existed and circulated in the Jewish world roughly 2,000 years ago. And commentaries were written on the Mishnah in different places. In particular, a commentary written on it in Babylonia, which evolved into the Babylonian Talmud. But a commentary was also written on it in the land of Israel, which we call somewhat erroneously the Jerusalem Talmud. It's really the Talmud of the land of Israel. But the Mishnah is basically, with very few exceptions, the same for both of these Talmuds. But the Talmudic text, the rabbinic commentary on the Mishnah, differs significantly between Babylonia and the land of Israel. And in particular, there are many tractates in the Talmud where there is Babylonian commentary, but no commentary from the land of Israel, and then tractates where it's the other way around. And then there are some tractates where there's commentary from both sources. So this happens to be the same tractate. It's Tractate Sanhedrin, but it's now from the so-called Yerushalmi, or the Talmud of the land of Israel. And what does this have to share with us? Well, one reason I do this is because part of what I try to accomplish with this class about abortion is to share with you what the different text strands are in Jewish tradition. And so I try to find something from the Yerushalmi that's relevant. It may not be super illuminating to the question of what does Judaism say about abortion, but I wanted to make sure that there was something from the Yerushalmi that I could share with you. And so this happens to be a text. And first of all, even though this is Tractate Sanhedrin, it's citing a Mishnah that we learned earlier. This was the Mishnah that we looked at in part 1 from a completely different tractate. And this was the Mishnah that talks about at what point in the process of labor does the fetus become an independent being, such that it's not treated like a pursuer, and we can protect the woman's life at all costs. So without going back over that Mishnah, let me just share that in the Yerushalmi it says, we learned in a Mishnah regarding a mother who experiences a difficult labor. And it's just citing that other Mishnah. And then it says, once most of the infant's head or body has emerged from the mother, we may not touch or harm the infant to save the mother's life, for we do not push aside one person's life on account of another person's life. And the inference from that is that up until that point, up until the bulk of the infant's body or the infant's head has emerged from the woman, until that point, then the converse holds. And it's not a situation of two equal human lives, but rather the woman's life, the mother's life, takes precedence. And we had seen that in the Mishnah earlier, but we see it confirmed here in the Yerushalmi. The Talmud is complicated for many reasons. It's largely written in Aramaic. It's filled with discourse, and oftentimes what we're interested in is to cut to the chase and to say, well, what's the answer? I don't really want to see how the sausage was made. I want to just know what the answer is. And so there were codes of Jewish law that were developed that extracted from the Talmud the answers, if you will. It puts forth a question and then simply states what the resolution is in the Talmud without giving all the substantiating arguments pro and con. So codes of Jewish law serve a purpose. They are kind of easier references, if you will, but they lack the context and they lack the supporting arguments. One of the most important codes of Jewish law was written by a rabbi who lived in 12th century Spain and then largely Egypt for the bulk of his life, known as Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, Moshe ben Maimon, the son of Maimon. Moses Maimonides, a giant rabbinic figure, really one of the greats of rabbinic history. He composed multiple works. The one we're going to be looking at today for citing one of his texts is a work known as the Mishnah Torah. So the Mishnah Torah was written in the mid-years of his life, in his 30s and 40s. In the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides takes the entire Talmud and extracts, as I said, sort of the answers. His idea was that this would help people out. He wrote the Mishnah Torah in 14 volumes. It's a vast work. Because the gematria, the numerical equivalent of the letters for 14 could be Yud and Daled, the word for arm. The Mishnah Torah is sometimes referred to as Yad or Yad HaChazakah, the strong arm or the strong hand, referring to God, but also here a kind of a play on the fact that it's 14 volumes, referring to it as Yad. So the Mishnah Torah is also divided up into not just the 14 books, but into treatises within those books. And the first passage I'm going to share is really basically a restatement of our Mishnah text, which we were looking at earlier. And in this Mishnah Torah passage, what we hear is the following. The sages have ruled that if a woman with child is having difficulty in giving birth, the child inside her may be taken out, either by drugs or by surgery, because it is regarded as one pursuing her and trying to kill her. But once its head has appeared, it must not be touched, for we may not set aside one human life to save another human life. And what is happening is the course of nature. So that's a passage from the Mishnah Torah. This is 12th century. And what's interesting is that Maimonides, the author of this work, was himself a physician, and a physician of quite much renown. He was the personal physician in Cairo to Saladin. So he supported the harem, he supported the royal family, and he had to be a very good physician to have secured that position. In fact, among his other writings are 10 known medical treatises dealing with topics like how to cure asthma and how to deal with hemorrhoids and antidotes for poisons and drug names and various other medical treatises. But here in the Mishnah Torah, he's now giving some indication that he's aware of the medical procedure involved if a woman is having difficulty in labor. And he says quite clearly that the child inside her may be taken out either by drugs or by surgery. Now, I don't think we had come across the possibility of the use of drugs to facilitate the abortion before. But because Maimonides is well versed in the medical procedures of his time, he shares that information with us. I want to jump now to another Talmudic passage, if I may. This now is another Babylonian Talmud passage, but I think it's very important. And this is a different tractate. This is Tractate Arachin. This happens to be page 7, side A, so folio side A. And it starts with a Mishnah. So I'm going to cite that because this is important. So it says, in regard to a pregnant woman who is going out to be executed. So this is a capital punishment situation. The woman has committed a crime. She's about to be executed, or she's been sentenced to be executed, but she happens to be pregnant. It's a very interesting situation. It says, in regard to a pregnant woman who is going out to be executed, we do not wait until she gives birth. I think that's a very telling statement. The woman is not treated, even though she's a convicted capital criminal, she's not treated as a breeding ground such that her job is to produce this child that is developing inside of her. And then once the baby is born, then she would get executed. That would be inhumane towards her, because that anxiety of knowing that you are sentenced to death and that you are simply being used for the purpose of producing a child, and that then immediately upon delivering that child, you would be put to death. That's cruel and inhuman torture, if you will. And so the Mishnah is quite clear that in regard to a pregnant woman who is going out to be executed, we do not wait until she gives birth. And then it says, in regard to a pregnant woman being tried for a capital offense, who sat on the birth stool. So she's actually starting to go into labor, and she's being tried for a capital offense. We wait until she gives birth. So the Mishnah is fairly clear about this. The Gemara, the Babylonian Talmud, comments on this Mishnah. So I'm going to read some of that to you. The Gemara goes on to say, it is obvious that we do not wait for a woman who is going out to be executed to give birth, for the fetus is part of her body, not an independent entity. So then it questions, why did the Mishnah even need to pose this situation? It should have been obvious. That says a lot, because it says that it's quite clear that the fetus, which has not begun to be delivered, and it doesn't say how far along this fetus has been developing, but it says that the fetus is part of her body. It's not an independent entity. And so there's clearly a hierarchy here of importance of the woman over the fetus. The reason the Talmud is actually addressing this case, it's trying to explain why the Mishnah even needed to bring this up, is because there are some property rights of the husband, or the father of the child, maybe more accurately. And the Talmudic text says that that we have to take his rights into account, because when she is executed, he will lose that fetus or any access to what the fetus might have produced if the fetus had come to birth. But it says that that his rights need to be addressed. I think it's clear that says that in the situation where the woman is going to be executed, that the Mishnah was posing that because of some other detail, meaning it was already obvious to them that the fetus does not have independent existence and is not treated with the same respect, if you will, or the same care as the mother is, because the mother is a living human being. So, and there are many other places we could be looking in the Talmudic literature or in the codes. I mentioned the Mishnah Torah. I cited one text from there. The maybe more familiar code by name for people is the Shulchan Aruch. This is probably some 400 years after the Mishnah Torah. Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro. This became quite the important code of Jewish law, but I think for one reason that's maybe a little bit simply fortuitous, it was produced around the time that printing was developed. And as you can imagine, a 12th century work, the Mishnah Torah, had to be produced by hand, by manuscript. And there are manuscript versions of the Mishnah Torah that date back to the time of Maimonides, or not long after him. We have some beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the Mishnah Torah. But imagine, had printing come into existence by that point, the Mishnah Torah would have been widely disseminated rapidly, and it would have gained some authority that it probably it didn't gain, because it would be hard for people to acquire it. When the Shulchan Aruch was composed, printing had just come into being, and so the Shulchan Aruch was widely disseminated and really did become quite an authoritative source. That's not to say that that's the only code of Jewish law that people look at. There are other codes of Jewish law, and the Mishnah Torah, for one, is certainly still cited and is quite important. I mentioned that the Talmud contains many arguments, and because it's not always so clear what's the answer in the Talmud, different traditions developed. And so so in the Ashkenazic world, a tradition may have developed on some particular topic, leading to a certain answer. And in the Sephardic world, it might have been a different answer. And so when a code of Jewish law is developed, a choice has to be made. And the Shulchan Aruch in and of itself was not accepted without an addition to it that tries to balance the competing traditions. So it's a complicated business. I just, I happen to love Jewish texts and Jewish text study, but it's not a fast path to getting an answer. I don't think that's the purpose of Jewish texts, just to get a quick answer. I want to shift gears quite a bit to a different strand of the Jewish text tradition. This goes now quite a ways away from the Talmud. It's the mystical strand, and probably the most important or the most well-known work in the mystical tradition is the Zohar. The Zohar was attributed to a rabbi of the Talmudic era, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but almost certainly, I believe scholars are quite convinced that it was falsely attributed to him as a way to popularize the work, that it was actually a much later work. And that's not so critical for our purposes. And neither is the text itself so informative on this topic, but I didn't want to leave the mystical strand out. So I just want to share with you a short passage from the Zohar. As you may know, the Zohar either introduces or reinforces concepts of different aspects to God, and the most familiar probably being the Shekhinah, the indwelling or the presence of God in sort of the human existence. and I try to view mysticism, at least very simplistically. I am not a Jewish mystic, but I try to view it as a way to bridge the gap between human beings and the divine. And the Kabbalistic approach is with various aspects to God, some of which are quite distant, if you will, transcendent, and some aspects which are much closer to us, more intimate. And the Shekhinah is the most intimate of those. So this Zoharic passage says there are three, meaning three categories of people who thrust Shekhinah away from the world. So that's a bad thing, because we want God's presence here in the world, and these three categories are people who thrust Shekhinah away from the world, preventing the blessed Holy One from dwelling in the world. So then it's going to go on to talk about what these three categories are. And it takes a little while to get to the third category, but in this one, it says, one who kills his children, the fetus carried by his wife, causing it to be killed in her belly, destroying the formation of the Blessed Holy One and his handiwork. There are those who kill a person, but this one kills his own children. So this suggests that at least in this one citation in the Zohar, there's some evidence that there's a pretty negative connotation associated with feticide. This is not used in legalistic terms. It's not used to establish some halachic precedent or some halachic principle. People do not look to the Zohar for legalistic advice, but I did want to share with you a little bit from that literature. I want to now jump back to the rabbinic tree, if you will, to the Talmudic branches. And in particular, I alluded to or mentioned earlier about responsa. So responsa continue to this day. There are volumes and volumes of responsa. And a lot depends on the authority who is composing the answer to a question that is posed. One example that I often use is a Jewish astronaut who's circling the Earth every 90 minutes. What does he do about observing Shabbat? Surely it's not every seventh rotation around the Earth, every seventh sunrise, if you will, is not another day. So how do you deal with that situation? Well, obviously the Talmud does not deal directly with that. And so when a responsum is presented to somebody, asking, or when a question is posed to somebody, they have to try to use analogies, and they have to try to know what the principles are behind various other rabbinic rulings in Talmudic sources. So that's how responsa work. And as I say, it's a vast literature. It can inform us, and it can also bring us up to date, because responsa continue to be written as new developments occur or as new technologies are developed. So this particular responsum, quite a tragic one, really. This is by Rabbi Ephraim Oshry. And he was in the ghetto during the Holocaust. And Rabbi Oshry was asked many questions in the ghetto that were particular to those circumstances. And this particular one was posed to him in August of 1942. And he says, I was asked whether a woman who had become pregnant in the ghetto might undergo an abortion, because the evildoers and defilers had decreed that any Jewish woman found to be pregnant would be killed. So it's a very problematic, very difficult situation that's posed to him, that if the woman becomes pregnant, she will be killed. Can there be an abortion under those circumstances? And I would imagine that you can jump ahead and predict where that answer is going to go. And I would say you would be right. What he says is, in that situation where it was clear that if the Germans discovered her pregnancy, neither the woman nor the fetus would survive, I ruled that it was permissible to abort the fetus in order to save the woman's life. So a very difficult situation to deal with, and one that hopefully never happens again, but one that is part of the rabbinic literature and is part of our Jewish text tradition. The Jewish text that is probably at least as familiar to many people as the Jewish Bible is the Jewish prayer book. It's yet another composition. It happens to be open-ended in the sense that people continue to compose new prayers and put out new prayer book editions. So I wanted to share with you a brief text from the Siddur, from the Jewish prayer book. It's one that's part of our morning service, and it says, Elohai Neshama shenatata bi tahorahi, the soul that you, my God, have given me, is pure. So clearly, we cite that work. We read from the prayer book. We're aware that the idea of a soul is part of our tradition. Some believe that it exists, some may not believe, but certainly within mainstream Jewish tradition, the idea of a soul is quite common. And so built into that prayer is a recognition that we are grateful for the soul that we've been given. And what it doesn't say is, when did we receive that soul? And of course, that could be a debate that could go on forever, because there really is no good way to establish the answer to that. But we reinforce this concept of a soul on a regular basis because it's built into the prayers that we recite. And I think it's actually good that we have prayer books that have the vernacular as well as the Hebrew. I think the Hebrew offers us a lot. It links us back to earlier generations, but the translation is important as well for those where the Hebrew text is not understandable. And I think we should be understanding what we are saying when we pray, certainly the gist of what we are saying. I'm going to share one last text. And this happens to be a collection of case law situations from Israel. It comes from a volume I have called Modern Applications of Jewish Law. And this happens to be a particular legal case. And it has the flavor of responsa, but it has one additional feature, that these are actually adjudicated situations in Israel law. And so I think it adds another dimension to the text, or to the text tradition. So the issue here that's posed, and I believe this is from 1981. So it says, the issue in this appeal was whether the husband has any standing under the law on the application of his wife for an abortion. And if you remember, there was a Talmudic text that I shared a little while ago from Tractate Arachin, where that was exactly where it was heading, was something about the husband or the father's rights, if you will. And I'll just share with you a little bit from this case. And one of the judges says, I have already concurred in setting aside the decision of the lower court ordering the appellant to refrain from having an abortion. The debate has always centered upon a number of questions which no one has yet been able to answer unequivocally. That's absolutely true. And these are the kinds of questions that I said we are looking at. What is the secret of life? When does life begin? From what moment is it properly to be protected? And should its deprivation be regarded as an offense, or at least forbidden? At one extreme, there are those who think that from the moment the embryo is created as a being or organic fact, which is the beginning of a human, any injury to it is forbidden. According to Jewish law, destruction of seed is a prohibited act, a fortiori, the killing of the embryo. And then it goes on to say, it would be a mistake to think that only in modern times has this extreme view been disputed. It goes on to say, in the period of the Gemara, that's the commentary on the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud is what he's referring to. During the first 40 days of conception, an embryo was considered a sack full of water. And if aborted within this period, the child that followed was the firstborn for ritual purposes. So this has to do with a different law altogether about the responsibility when there has been a firstborn. And so if there's an abortion, a spontaneous abortion during those first 40 days, is a subsequent child who's born considered the firstborn or not? That's what's being addressed there. Then it says, similarly, it was usual to divide pregnancy into periods with regard to the seriousness of injury to the fetus. Some would adopt a lenient attitude during the first 3 months. There are also tests of movement or the ability of the fetus to be viable, to live upon coming into the world. And there are different phases to the pregnancy. And it says already in the period of the Mishnah, a fetus was not considered a complete person or a soul. If a woman is in hard travail, one may cut up the child in her womb and remove it member by member, because her life comes before its life. If, however, the greater part has come out, one may not touch it, since one may not reject one life for another. And that's simply citing the Mishnah passage that we looked at quite some time ago in the first section. I think the point is, and I will just close with this, that Jewish texts provide great insight into how people have grappled with important topics over the millennia. Starting back with the biblical texts that we looked at in part 1, all the many commentaries on those texts, the translations of those texts, and then the Mishnaic and Talmudic branch of Jewish text study, the midrashic works, the mystical works, the prayer book, the responsa. There are many, many, many Jewish texts, and it can maybe be frustrating if the goal is to have a simple answer, but I think Judaism respects our intelligence and knows that there really are no simple answers to these difficult questions. And we can apply these techniques of looking at the sources to gain some insight. We can apply these techniques to any question that comes up, and I encourage you to go off and explore on your own. And thank you for taking the time to hear this Jewish perspective on abortion.